Friends, Friedrich Nietzsche was a German who lived in the 19th century. And his dates are 1844 to 1900. He was a brilliant university student. He obtained a professorship at the age of 24. He was not a philosopher, though. He was a philologist. A philologist is somebody who studies the origin of languages. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, was a philologist and actually conceived of Lord of the Rings as a way of building a story around the Elvish language, which he invented as a novel language. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke and read about 23 languages. He was an expert in the origins of words and where languages come from. Unfortunately for him, though, his life was very unhappy. As a young man, when he was a professor, he lost out in a love triangle. The woman he was trying to pair up with, Lou Salome, ended up going with the other guy. And Nietzsche was heartbroken. He vowed that he was never going to love again. And he didn't. He also, from that day forward, took a very different and negative view of women. He became what's called a misogynist. Misogyny is somebody who, it's the hatred of women. And Nietzsche peppers his writings with toss-away comments like, the only truly evil element in the history of Western thought has been the female element. I'll say things like that. Okay? When I see those kinds of comments in Nietzsche, I think to myself, well, I think Lou Salome probably made a smart choice in going with the other guy. Okay, Nietzsche was eventually, because of his radical views, you'll see how radical he was in a minute, he was stripped of his professorship. And he was actually, for most of his life, an outcast. He spent his time writing books as a solitary thinker, separated from society, rejected by many. But in that space of independence and rejection, he writes some of the most profound criticisms of Western thought ever developed. In 1890, he was writing at his desk one day, as he did each day, and he looked out the window of his house, and in the street outside his house, he saw a cabbie who was beating his horse. This was prior to the age of cars. So cabbies drove wagons with horses. And Nietzsche snapped. And he rushed outside and he threw his arms around the horse to block the cabbie from beating the horse. And he began singing at the top of his lungs. And they led him away to an insane asylum, where he spent the last 10 years of his life. For 10 years, the last 10 years of his life, he was unaware that his writings had made him a famous man. And even as his ideas spread around the world and made him perhaps the most influential modern philosopher, he himself was dying of insanity and ultimately syphilis, which he contracted as a young man in a sexual liaison. Although he hated women, it didn't mean he stopped having relations. Friedrich Nietzsche is a fascinating character. He has a kind of a hatred of certain people and things about him, and yet that hatred drove him to come up with a way of looking at the world which was so different than everybody else had looked at the world. that it was novel, creative, and has earned him a place in the canon. Speaking personally, I find Nietzsche fascinating. I disagree with just about everything he wrote. Perhaps there's no philosopher that I teach this semester who I disagree with more profoundly than Friedrich Nietzsche. And yet, Nietzsche has reasons for saying what he says. He is an insightful and profound thinker. And whether or not you agree with him, he has been incredibly influential and is deserving of a hearing as such, because a lot of people have found his ideas to be meaningful. Okay, there's not much else to say about Nietzsche's biography. He lived a quiet life, didn't live an especially long life, only about 46 years of sanity before he went insane. But it was a quiet life, a life of a bachelor, a life of separation from the world, and a life of hostility to what he saw around him and reflection on its problems and missteps and mistakes. Let me stop and see if there are questions about his biography or about his life and times. He was insane for the last 10 years of his life as he died of syphilis. Yeah, he didn't know that he'd become a famous man. Syphilis is a venereal disease that acts on the brain, and it causes people to lose their mind if it's left untreated. You can treat it these days with antibiotics. Something snapped about him. Yeah, he began singing at the top of his lungs and was led away to an insane asylum. You can see pictures of him sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch of the insane asylum. Actually, pictures of Nietzsche are pretty cool. If you've got a laptop open, look him up. This guy had a stash to die for. Okay, and I wish I could show you guys Nietzsche and his mustache up here on the screen, but the tech doesn't allow me to show anything but PowerPoints up here. Okay, so maybe Zaire can show us all Nietzsche's mustache. Okay, or Tiffany. All right, let's talk a little bit about Nietzsche's great criticisms of Western thought. Okay, it's something to see, isn't it? I asked my wife once whether I should grow a stash like that. She said that if I ever did that, she would stop kissing me for the rest of my life. Let's look at this section called The Problem of Socrates. This is in Twilight of the Idols. Okay, page 39 for me. I'll be dipping in and reading here and there in this famous text. The Problem of Socrates. For Nietzsche, the Western philosophical tradition has been mistaken from the beginning. And in order to understand the mistake, you've got to go all the way back to the founder of the tradition, Socrates. Back at the beginning of the semester, we encountered this dude named Socrates in Plato's Dialogues. And Socrates was this Athenian who lived a simple life and who went around Athens and asked difficult questions of his fellow Athenians. He asked them questions like, what is virtue? Can virtue be taught? What is the soul? Do you have a soul? Is the soul immortal? What can I know? What are the limits of our knowledge? And these questions made his contemporaries in Athens, especially the prominent citizens, very uncomfortable. And we remember from the beginning of the semester that the Athenian authorities put him on trial for corrupting the youth and dishonoring the gods. And ultimately they convicted him, and he was executed by drinking hemlock. Now, that's the story that the tradition has told us about Socrates. That Socrates was a heroic figure who died for the sake of freedom of thought and inquiry, and for the sake of discerning truth. And if you think about the method that Socrates used, he used a method where he thought that reason, if we just reason together about a topic like what is virtue or is the soul immortal, reason will lead us to the truth of the matter about that topic. Reason, if employed correctly and in a persevering way, will lead to truth. That's the Socratic method. To dialogue with each other together as a team, to use our reason in order to discern the truth of the matter about the fundamentals of the universe, about ourselves, about our own natures, and about the world around us. Again, or so the tradition has told us. But for Nietzsche, that's not what Socrates was at all. Socrates was not, according to Nietzsche, an honest and sincere inquirer who sought to use reason in order to determine the truth of the matter about things. Socrates was not an honest and sincere philosopher who saw himself as just being a simple inquirer among others and who sought to enlist others in a common quest to understand humans and the world. That wasn't what Socrates was at all. For Nietzsche, Socrates was a devious, scheming conspirer. Because you see, Socrates wanted more than anything else to have power over his fellow humans, according to Nietzsche. What Socrates wanted more than anything else was power. And he realized, because he was brilliant, he realized that the emperors and kings of this world have only simple external forms of power available to them, because all they can do is use their soldiers and their prisons to control the external body, to imprison those who disagree with them. But Socrates realized that real power comes not from controlling the external body, but from controlling the mind internally. And so Socrates devised a way, Nietzsche says, to control men's minds, to shape their thoughts so thoroughly that he, Socrates, would dominate them and control their thinking. And Nietzsche says this is what happened. This is precisely what has happened down through the philosophical history of our civilization. Socrates and his mind-controlling scheme won. I'll catch you in just a second, Charles. Socrates and his mind-controlling scheme won. Because Socrates convinced the whole tradition to use reason to seek truth. All the thinkers in the tradition, everybody we have encountered in the tradition has assumed the things that Socrates laid out, assumed the parameters of the discussion that Socrates set up for us. Namely, that you can use reason to discern truth. Aristotle says we can use reason to identify happiness as that at which all human beings aim, and to identify also that you have to be virtuous in order to obtain true happiness. Augustine says we can use reason to understand God and ourselves and recognize that we are sinful beings and in need of assistance from God. Aquinas says we can use reason to discern that God exists and to prove that God is the creator of the universe. Descartes says we can use reason to identify what we can know and what the limits of our knowledge are and how certain we can be in our knowledge. Hume says we can use reason to ascertain that cause and effect and the cause and effect relationship govern and structure our thought about the world, and that these are functions of our minds. and not necessarily in the world in itself. All of these thinkers have all played the Socratic game. They all have all participated in the parameters of the discussion as laid out by Socrates. They have all used reason to try to discern truth. And so Socrates won. Socrates ended up controlling the minds of millennia of people, all of whom used the Socratic formula, let's employ reason to discern the truth of the matter about ourselves and about the world. Charles. Yeah, man, Socrates manipulated us all. We're all playing the Socratic game. It is a form of mind control. And even though Socrates died, still in death, he won and gained control over the tradition. That's at least Nietzsche's view. Okay, questions or comments so far? So what is the problem of Socrates? The problem of Socrates, according to Nietzsche, is that Socrates was ugly. Socrates was ugly. That's the problem. Write this down. I don't see people writing this down. Socrates was ugly. That's the problem of Socrates. Socrates was ugly. Was this Nietzsche's thought before or after he got rejected? All of his great writings come after the rejection from Lou Salome, man. I'm sure that rejection deeply shaped his interpretation of the tradition, man. Rejection is hard to deal with. The problem of Socrates is that Socrates was ugly. Notice that the problem of Socrates is not that Socrates was wrong. To use the words right and wrong is to assume that truth exists. To say somebody is wrong is to assume that there is a truth of the matter to be found in a particular circumstance, a state of affairs that is correct. And that person being wrong has misinterpreted or misjudged that state of affairs, gotten it wrong. To use words like right and wrong is to play the Socratic game. To say that there's a right and there's a wrong is to operate within the parameters of philosophy as laid out by Socrates. Because Socrates told us that there's a truth to be found and that we can use our reason to discern that truth. And to assume that there's a truth to be found about ourselves, about the world, about God, about our surroundings, to assume that there's a truth to be found is to operate in the tradition in the way that Socrates laid out. So Nietzsche, in calling Socrates ugly, is trying to find a way to criticize Socrates that doesn't stay within the bounds of the Socratic game. Because to say that Socrates is wrong is to still abide by the rules laid out by Socrates, namely that there is right and wrong and truth to be found. But what if there is no truth? What if there's no truth about ourselves? No truth about the world, no truth about God, no truth about the natural order that surrounds us. If there's no truth to be found, then there's no right and wrong. If there's no right and wrong, then we can't criticize people by saying they're wrong. Socrates was ugly. What does Nietzsche mean by that? Here's what he seems to mean. That ugliness was in his physiognomy, in his face. And Nietzsche thinks that that ugliness was emblematic of a deeper character trait of deviousness. Okay, a deep character trait of deception and of deviousness. So the problem of Socrates is that Socrates was ugly and therefore devious, deceptive. Socrates used deception to make people think that he was just a fellow inquirer like them, who was seeking truth alongside everybody else, when in fact he wanted mind control. Socrates was ugly means that Socrates was a deceiver who sought a roundabout way to gain power over others. Here's a concept we're going to look at, a famous, very important Nietzschean concept, which we'll look at in greater length momentarily. Maybe, actually next time, maybe we won't get to it this time. But I'll just mention it for now. It's called the will to power. If there's no truth, no right and no wrong, no state of affairs that is true about the world or about ourselves or about God, then all that is left, Nietzsche says, is power. And whoever gains power wins. There are winners and losers, even if there's no truth, and the winners are the ones with power, and the losers are the ones who don't have it. What Socrates wanted was power. But the problem of Socrates is that he didn't seek power in a straightforward, honorable way. He sought it in a roundabout way, a deceptive way. He wasn't like an emperor marching troops into battle, straightforwardly asserting his power. Instead, he sought to disguise what he was doing. He sought to fool others into going along with it, into thinking that they too were fellow inquirers alongside Socrates. So what's the problem with that, Charles? That is totally a Nietzschean thought. Nietzsche believed himself to have correctly interpreted the entirety of the tradition, and the entirety of the tradition was deceived. I mean, you can call it arrogant, but man, oh man, he came up with some novel thoughts that nobody else had. Okay, and again, this is not my worldview. This is not my worldview. But every time you hear somebody say, it's all relative, or you have your way of doing things and I have my way of doing things, and there's no judging between us. Okay, or there's no such thing as right and wrong, there are just different viewpoints. Every time you hear somebody say that, every time somebody espouses a cultural relativist view, or an interpersonal relativist view, they are saying Nietzschean things. Those thoughts come from Nietzsche. Nietzsche is perhaps the most influential modern philosopher because he is the father of relativism. We would not have contemporary relativism as a worldview if it weren't for Nietzsche. Okay, so whether or not you agree with them, and I happen to disagree with them on basically everything, as I've mentioned, still, we need to take him seriously because of his vast influence. Okay, Nietzsche says there's a will to power that everybody has. Now, there's no problem with having a desire for power. We all have a desire for power. We can't help it. Each one of us wants power, power over others. That's our ultimate desire. Each one of us, if we look into our heart of hearts, that's all we really want. We just want power, power over others, power to do as we please, power to obtain all the pleasures we desire, power to conform others to our will. So there's no problem with Socrates wanting power. The problem is that Socrates went about it in such a devious, roundabout way. Prior to Socrates, we find in Western culture warrior cultures, honor shame traditions, prior to the Socratic way of thinking. For Nietzsche, that's what we need to return to in order to set Western civilization on the right track. Okay, we need to return to a time period prior to right and wrong thinking, a time period where honor is upheld. That's the problem ultimately with women, in Nietzsche's view. Women want power too, just like men do. But they're not physically stronger, so they deceive. They seduce. They try to get inside people's heads. They try to control men through mind control. He was heartbroken, man. He was really heartbroken, poor guy. So that's the problem with women. It's the same thing as the problem with Socrates, is their devious methods. Okay, let me just illustrate the will to power concept using a Nietzschean analysis of a contemporary event, and then we'll get back to the mainstream of thought about the problem of Socrates. I want to illustrate the will to power so you guys understand what he means by this. Let me do a quick Nietzschean analysis of a contemporary event. Okay, so this last summer, the United States was engulfed in social justice marches because of the death of George Floyd. Okay, and the police officer who killed George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, was, I believe it was last week, I think he was convicted. Okay, and the social justice marchers this last summer, many people from many walks of life. Okay, it wasn't just African Americans, it was Americans from all sorts of different walks of life, marched because they wanted justice. They asserted that the institutional fabric of the country was unjust. By that is meant unequal. It discriminates against certain classes, groups of people. It's set up against them. Okay, and they demanded, social justice marchers demanded a more just society, a society with institutional change that reflects values of equality, values of freedom, values of respect and dignity for all people. Okay, or so they said. A Nietzschean analysis would view that phenomenon as follows. What the social justice marchers really wanted was power. Power over others. Now, human beings who want power don't usually go around saying that. They'll say things like, we want equality, or we want justice, or we want dignity, we want respect. They'll use the language of right and wrong, right? If there's a justice to be found institutionally, that means there's a right way to set society up institutionally. It assumes the idea that there is justice or equality assumes that right and wrong exist. Charles. Like the Amish people?
Yeah, like they just trying to like live.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'll get to the Amish example in just a minute. That's a great objection. I want to say one more thing about the social justice marchers, then we'll get to the Amish people. The social justice marchers disguised their desire for power in the language of social justice. They really wanted control, but they used words like equality and dignity and respect to make people think that they just wanted a fair shake, an equal chance like everybody else. But everybody wants power. Everyone wants power. Even the Amish want power. How do the Amish want power? Well, the Amish are a people group who have separated themselves from the world. They aren't seeking political gain. They've separated themselves from the world because they think the world is corrupting. They want to preserve a way of life that they think is more honoring to God, that they think will enable future generations of Amish people to experience greater flourishing without all the distractions and dangers and corrupting influences of modern technologies and modern ways of life. Or so they say. But you know what they really want? They want power. According to a Nietzsche, they want power. They think that in the afterlife, they're going to be rewarded more than everybody else. And they think that they're actually going to be better off and gain ascendancy over others by virtue of their separate way of life, by virtue of their avoidance of corruption. What they really desire is power over others, just not power obtained in this life, power that they think will only come in the afterlife. That's the Nietzschean analysis of the Amish. Everybody wants power, according to Nietzsche. That's what we all want. Okay, Nietzsche is a perspectivalist. He doesn't want to assume, like the whole rest of the tradition has assumed, that there's a truth to be found. There is no truth of the matter about human virtue or about the soul or about God or about the natural world. They're just different truths. No truth as such, just different truths. There's your truth and there's my truth. There's Bianca's truth and Malamatenia's truth and Tiffany's truth. It's what works for us. It's whatever your perspective happens to be. He is a perspectivalist. He thinks that all that there really is just different points of view, different perspectives, but no correct perspective. No viewpoint that's better than the others, objectively speaking. This perspectivalism is the only way he can think of to get outside of the Socratic way of thought, to get outside of this idea that there is a right and a wrong and a truth to be found in any state of affairs or in any human matter. Perspectivalism. In other words, there are different points of view, but no viewpoints that is better. Okay, I've mentioned before when we were talking about natural law earlier this semester, I mentioned before, imagine an Aztec warrior here defending their human sacrifice practices and saying, this is the way our culture does it. This is what works for us. And who are you to judge us? For Nietzsche, that's just his perspective. That's just his perspective. You have your perspective where you think that innocent life should be preserved. And Aztec priests shouldn't choose random victims and carve their hearts out and throw them down heartless the steps of the Pyramid of the Moon. That's your perspective. Aztec warrior has his perspective. We all have different perspectives. Well, no one perspective is better than any other. They're just different perspectives. Okay, and that's how Nietzsche tries to get around the Socratic way of thinking. The idea that reason can be used to seek truth, which assumes, of course, that there's a truth to be found. Folks, I've been talking for a little while. Let me stop and ask if there are questions or comments about the lecture. Reflections or thoughts? Yeah, say it. Perspectivalism, yeah. Yeah, we've all got different truths. Your truth, my truth. We all have different perspectives, different points of view. There is no correct view. They're just different views. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tiffany. You guys speak up just a little bit. I'm having trouble hearing through your mask. Okay. Nietzsche. Nietzsche. Yeah, you're there. Okay. Correct? Good. Okay, great comment. So the comment is that the perspectivalist is inconsistent. Okay, I don't know if you realized that that was the comment, but that's definitely what you're saying. The perspectivalist is inconsistent because the perspectivalist accuses others of seeking to control by claiming that there is truth to be found. Perspectivalist says there's no truth to be found. They're just different truths. Well, in saying that, the perspectivalist does two things. One, he is assuming that there is at least one truth. That truth is that there is no truth to be found. Right? There is no single perspective. They're just different perspectives. That is a truth, right, that he's asserting. And two, he's also asserting that he has a perspective, namely that there is no perspective that is true, which should give him special power over others, namely it is the correct perspective. Am I getting your question right or your objection right, Tiffany? Yeah. What do you think? Correct? He's not judging them for wanting to seek power. He's judging them for the dishonorable way they are seeking power. Yes, that's right. Everybody wants power. We all can't escape it, yeah. Yeah, okay, so let's deal with the inconsistency objection for a minute. Charles, did you have a response to that? Or?
Yeah, like, did he include himself in it? Like,
Yeah. He would have included himself in that and said, I too am seeking power. Okay, the objection that the relativist or the perspectivalist is at bottom not a relativist or perspectivalist because he is asserting that there's at least one truth, namely it's all relative, is an age-old objection. And I have never heard a good relativist response to it. Okay, so I'm going to take a stab, and this is not something that Nietzsche ever actually says. It's just something that is implied by his work. And I'm going to say Nietzsche would have probably responded by saying, so what? So I'm inconsistent. Part of being a perspectivalist is being inconsistent. Because that's one of the central messages of perspectivalism is there is no consistent truth. It's just all inconsistent. Okay, so let me take an example from literature. You guys are all familiar with the character of Hamlet from Shakespeare's great tragedy, Hamlet. Right, everybody read this in high school? Yes, maybe? Okay. If you didn't read Hamlet, please do so before you leave college. This is one of the great works of Western literature. Please try to... people have read some Shakespeare, at least, if not Hamlet, I hope. Okay. If you remember back, dim and distant past in your literature class, remember Hamlet. What's Hamlet's problem? What does he just sort of like think about the whole play? You guys remember? No, don't worry about it. That's cool, that's cool. I can't remember what I read yesterday, so, you know, it's all good. So Hamlet is a play where Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, has this uncle who has killed his father and married his mother and seized the kingdom. Okay, and Hamlet spends the play thinking about revenge. Okay, if you remember it now, maybe a little bit, that's what's going on. But you know what Hamlet's problem is throughout the entirety of the play? He's indecisive. He's indecisive. He can't decide. Can't decide whether he's going to seek revenge or not. Can't decide how he's going to do it if he does it. Heck, he can't decide whether he wants to live or not. His famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. He's not even sure if he wants to live. He's indecisive. Nietzsche reads Hamlet. Okay, he reads Hamlet very differently than I do. But Nietzsche reads Hamlet and he says, Hamlet got it. Hamlet stares into the abyss of life. You know, the yawning, like massive hole, black hole that is life. He stares into the abyss of life and he realizes there's nothing there. There's nothing worth living for. There's no value that's true, no worldview that's right, or other worldviews that are wrong. There's nothing there. It's all relative. Okay, now think back to Hamlet. Maybe I've jogged your memory a little bit. What happens at the end of the play? Spoiler alert. What happens at the end of the play? Is it okay if I tell you guys all right, you guys don't mind? Okay, what happens at the end of all the Shakespeare tragedies? They all die. They all die. It happens at the end of all the Shakespeare tragedies. Okay? They all die. He gets revenge. He gets revenge. He knocks off the uncle, and his mother just sort of conveniently dies, and then he dies. Okay, and everybody dies at the end, right? Okay. It's typical Shakespeare ending. You know what Hamlet did? Even in spite of his realization that there's nothing in the abyss of life? This is, again, Nietzsche's interpretation, not mine, not mine. He acted anyway. He realized there's nothing there, there's nothing worth living for, and then he acted anyway, and he lived in the face of the nihilistic abyss that is life. Okay, so, you guys maybe have heard of nihilism before? Nihilism is just a philosophical worldview that says that nothing matters. Nothing worth living for, nothing matters. What's that? That's a great viewpoint? you tell that to a girlfriend and see how that goes. Nothing matters, babe. It's all relative. You're relative with all the other girls. It's like, you're nothing special. Like, nothing matters, right? Okay. All right. So, Hamlet, according to Nietzsche, again, this is just Nietzsche's interpretation of Hamlet. Hamlet, according to Nietzsche, stares into the abyss of life. He realizes there's nothing that matters. It's all relative. And he acts anyway. He makes something of his life. He makes values for himself. He generates his own values. That's the key to living, according to Nietzsche. The key to living successfully is to make your own values, to make truth for yourself. Maybe your thing, what gives you meaning in life, is making sandwiches on Saturday mornings for the homeless. Then do that. That is truth for you. You have made values for yourself and made something of your life. You've made a life worth living. Maybe your thing, what really gives you meaning in life, is molesting 7-year-olds. Then do that. If that's what gives you meaning, if that's what makes life worth living for you, those are your values. It doesn't really matter what values you choose. What matters is that you choose. What matters is that you choose. In the face of nihilism, in the face of the abyss of life where nothing matters, you should act heroically, Nietzsche says, and make something of your life by generating your own values, choosing your way, It doesn't matter what course you choose, just choose. Choose something. Yes, Charles. Actually, this is a really if you truly believe that the world is nihilistic and there's nothing that matters, this is a heroic thing. Like you choose in the face of the nothingness. Okay. Well, it's not my worldview. I'll say that. Okay. But the relativism has been very influential. Okay. Whenever you hear anybody say, look, it doesn't matter if if they're beating the women in Saudi Arabia, and we say beating the women is immoral, right? It's the way they do things. They can do things the way they do things, and we do things the way we do things. Where women have equality, right? And different strokes for different folks. Every time you hear somebody say that sort of a thought, that's a Nietzschean thought. That's a Nietzschean thought that is based in this perspectivalist approach to life. Okay. Other questions before we take a break? Tiffany. So Nietzsche would consider himself a moral nihilist. Yeah, a moral nihilist. Because in the face of the reality that it's all relative, he chooses to make a meaningful life. So that's a moral thing, is to choose. Again, it doesn't really matter what you choose for Nietzsche. The important thing is that you choose. You need to make values for yourself. If the murderer, assuming it's like a calculated, reflective murderer who really thought about it and, decided to make maybe an artistic phenomenon or something like that out of the murder. Something where, he was able to express himself deeply expressive, and not just a spur of the moment sort of thing, crime of passion or something, right? Deeply expressive of himself, like his deepest values. That is something to be celebrated, not something to be condemned. There's actually a famous murder case. 2 University of Chicago students in the early 20th century, after reading Nietzsche in their philosophy class, went out and committed what they thought was the perfect murder. It's a very famous murder case in the early 20th century. Over a break, I'll find it on Wikipedia and I'll reference it for you guys. It's actually an example of this. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. As long as it truly expresses who you are, if that's who you are, then that's okay. That's cool. Okay, you guys got to be careful going out of this class, right? It's philosophy class, so anything goes. Okay, good point, great point. Yeah. Sure, yeah, like what if that's who you are? And like that's what makes values and life meaningful for you, is you like giving out left hooks in the morning. Some people don't like receiving them, Some people may like that, but others don't like receiving them. Yeah.
So is it okay? Is everything that makes you feel good okay?
Yeah. So couple comments here. One is Nietzsche's not a systematic thinker, so he doesn't really seem to be especially interested in the question of can people live in society together where everyone is producing their own values, generating their own values for themselves. Second comment is society, Western society, in adapting Nietzsche has really modified some of the rougher edges. Okay, so whereas a lot of people these days are relativists, they're not really Nietzschean style relativists, they're more soft relativists. By soft relativists, I mean they're not really relativists, they just say they are. When it comes down to it, they're not relativists. So they may like spout off with their mouths and some quackery about how, it's all relative, And then when you reach into their pocket and steal their wallet and say, it's all relative, man, it's all relative, they get mad and they like punch you. Because they in their heart of hearts, they don't really believe it's relative. They think that there's right and wrong and you've wronged them. So So first comment is Nietzsche didn't really think about life in society very much. That question was not that important to him. The second comment is, in appropriating Nietzsche's thought, Western civilization has modified it and has done so in an inconsistent way. So all those people who are saying Nietzschean things like it's all relative are not really relativists at the end of the day. Yeah?
Oh, is that why he went crazy when somebody was doing something to his work? Because he couldn't say it was right or wrong, so he decided to.
Maybe the inconsistency within his own soul was just like too much, and so he just started singing a song. I don't know. Maybe so. I don't know. I think that there's a connection between these guys' philosophies and their personal lives. There almost always is. And if he couldn't abide the inconsistencies in his own mind as he's saying these things and writing these things and then living, then maybe that's what caused him to snap. I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, let's let that be the last word before break. The last word is Western culture, in appropriating Nietzschean thought and making Nietzsche such an influential philosopher, has done so in a modified, selective way. They have appropriated the perspectivalism, and relativism has become widespread, but it's been a selective relativism because people at the end of the day are not relativists. They just say they are. It's just sort of a soft relativism where it makes them feel better to say they're relativists because it feels like they're not judging people, but they're not really relativists. They do think there's right and wrong, and all you have to do to prove that is to do something that hurts them. And when it comes down to it, when the chips are down, they slug you in return because they actually do believe they have been wronged. Okay, we'll stop there for a break, 2 to 3 minutes, and I'm going to find this murder case.